On one of those important days, a wyvern circled high in the sky, freer than anyone else. And that was the only reason he decided to stop being the problem solver for the great family of magicians, the Deculans. The main character kept the enemy at bay with his magic and saw that he was the only one left. But the enemy saw that the #1 problem solver had hidden his abilities. And a simple problem solver should not possess such abilities. But the main character said that here he would ask him questions. But when he found the book, he thought it was a grimoire. The enemy held on with all his might and saw that the book was a grimoire. But Varg saw that the Eliminator thought he had attracted others in order to catch one stray dog. But the main character understood that they were nobodies from the Deculan family and would start running around again like mad mongrels. But the main character saw that this man was his enemy. But the guy didn't think so and didn't understand what he was talking about. The Liquidator understood that if the greedy Deculan knew, they would not have hidden the book in their vault. And he didn't know how to use it, but he followed him so far. And that means it's very valuable. The enemy asked the main character to give him the grimoire. He would beg him for mercy. And who would be able to return as a problem solver, or rather as a hunting dog? But the Eliminator decided to find out if he had enough strength as a regular manager of Eliminators, and asked him to say his last words. But the enemy said nothing and used his masterful screams. The Liquidator was glad that the enemy had finally revealed his true nature. And that was excellent. But slowly, footsteps began to approach behind him, and the Liquidator immediately began to sense danger. The stranger saw that the Liquidator had good instincts, and the main character understood that this man radiated fierce energy. The stranger let him know that he was glad to meet him, and introduced himself as Farron von Deculan. He was the head of the magical Deculan family of the Eastern Continent. The Liquidator immediately realized that this was the head of the Deculan family. The head believed that his Liquidator would be kind enough to give him the grimoire that was in his hands, and then they could talk. The main character realized that after decades of being a problem solver, this was the first time he had personally met the head of the family. The Deculan family is a magical family that rules the Eastern Continent, and its head is the most powerful magician in history. But the Liquidator does not know what kind of person he is. But the Eliminator warned the head that he loses his temper when he sees such people, and he wants to seize someone else's prey, which the person obtained with great difficulty. How can he not be ashamed? The head was surprised by such loud words and began to laugh without stopping. The Liquidator believed that he should have eaten that viper when he had the chance. Unfortunately, the head of the family came to him personally, and he had a serious aura. He was the strongest mage he had ever met. The head informed the young man that it would be easier to kill him and simply return the grimoire, but it was time to get down to business. The Liquidator should return to the shadows of Deculan, hand over the grimoire, and then all his sins will be forgiven. The leader decided to ask him what he would say to that, and as he sees it, his talent is amazing. And seeing him fight firsthand, he regretted not recognizing him earlier. And he considers him a dirty rat from the slums, who scavenged through garbage that only problem solvers touch. And how did he reach such a level? And how high can he fly with Deculan's wings? And how far can a blade like him take Deculan? And now he asks him to rise alongside him, and made Deculan even greater. And his name should leave its mark on history. The Eliminator still thought he needed to return to Deculan, and the head also believed that the grimoire should be returned. Hearing that the guy agreed with him, he asked him to give him the grimoire, but the Liquidator set his conditions. The head became curious. The Liquidator told him to give up his position as head of the family, and then they would talk. Meanwhile, he kept his fist clenched and remembered that the head had said he had been watching the battles. While clenching his fist, he tightened the wire around his enemy's neck and slowly sent him to the other world. The Liquidator decided to find out how many people had died from this, but the head didn't like it and immediately understood his plan. And when he saw his man die before his eyes, he began to hate this guy even more. The boss told him that the Liquidator could die right now, but the main character was not afraid and replied that this was damn right. He immediately ran towards the boss and used his electric shock, but the boss used his defense. But the main character told him to measure it himself, whether it would be longer or faster. But the head believed that he first needed to subdue him, and he used a magic seal. After making this seal, a rock appeared above the guy and rose straight towards him. But the Liquidator used his light defense. The head was serious, and the Liquidator was in shock, so much so that he could have gone mad. He tried to dodge all the attacks, running fast and realizing that this was the power of the head of the Deculan family. and he didn't have a single chance to break through. During this, the head asked him to think again. He understood that the guy wanted to measure the difference in strength himself, and some things don't need to be tested. What a gap between them. Seeing the fiery flames in front of him, the liquidator was shocked and did not expect such a turn of events. But the fire was so powerful that it caused an explosion. But the head made it clear that he would let him live, and he decided to find out if he had changed his mind about the conversation. But the liquidator decided to find out what would happen if he bowed his head and returned to the shadow of the Deculan family. The head was surprised and thought that he would do so, but the liquidator turned out to be a smart guy and sent him away using his magic seal. And he made it clear that he was tired of eating dog food. Using all his strength, he sent it through an electric prism and aimed it at the enemy. The liquidator did not know what kind of person would agree to become a dog again. A fashionable collar and a large kennel would not change the essence. But the head appeared after a huge cloud of smoke and thought that the liquidator was just a fool. He used magic and expanded his energy over the entire territory, and he let him see his superior power. The liquidator realized that things were bad, and he considered it a curse, and now he understands. On that day, when he looked up at the sky and saw a freely flying wyvern, that was the reason he was looking up. But the head was impressed that the liquidator did not die, but withstood the blow. And now he probably feels the difference. The liquidator felt that the head was disgustingly strong, but the head still tried to talk to him, and he offered to tell him the story he couldn't finish. The liquidator decided to ask him if he really wanted him to be his problem solver again. The head thought for a moment and replied that he had expressed himself incorrectly. He did not mean a problem solver, but rather the head of a subordinate family. The liquidator was very surprised to hear about becoming the head of a subordinate family. He understood that Deculan, the leading family on the eastern continent, was competing with the imperial power, and he offered him to become the head of a loyal subordinate family. And now the liquidator understood what his goal was. But the head saw that the guy still underestimated his importance. He himself was in first place. The grimoire was only a secondary desire. The liquidator made up his mind and handed him the book. The head was delighted and thought that the boy had thought it through well, and now all his sins would be forgiven. With Deculan, only glory awaited him. But at the last moment, the liquidator used fire magic and slowly began to burn the book. The head did not understand what he was doing. The liquidator told him to take it, and if he needed it after he turned to dust, and he would never find peace. The liquidator told him to shut up and listen, and liquidators don't care about money. So why did he take the book? The answer is because it is priceless. The chief actually knows about the liquidators, absorbed by the young master of the Deculan family. The head even replied himself that it was forbidden magic. The liquidator understood that this was true, and that bastard ate their comrades, and Deculan covered his tracks. The boss thought it was revenge, but the liquidator didn't understand why there were so many questions. Even mongrels know that their lives are worthless, but they just wanted to realize their damn dreams, and that requires money. Also, they won't return to their kennel after leaving. The leader turned around and heard his last words, but the liquidator had already cast a spell that followed the enemy. The leader ordered him to see the azure flame of Deculan and the eternal, unquenchable flame, and he should regret his choice to the depths of his soul. But the liquidator thought it was bullshit, and it was better to die than to become a Deculan dog again. And if that didn't happen, then death wasn't so bad. Finally, the liquidator began to laugh loudly. He could smell freedom, and how long it had been absent from his life. But it was a little sad that he was able to free himself while still alive. But he had no regrets. And if he were reborn, he would take full advantage of his freedom and complete his revenge. The liquidator spread his arms and finally felt free. But when he opened his eyes, he saw that everything had frozen in place. Even Grimoire remained intact. But when he lifted him into the sky, the magic began to work, and the seals moved directly onto his chest. He did not understand what this meant. After all, this was the first time this had happened to him. But after what happened, he opened his eyes and saw a coin being thrown into his vessel in front of him. He didn't understand what was happening. After all, he had just been burned alive. He didn't realize where he was. He felt as if he had returned to the past. Everything seemed so familiar. And suddenly he remembered everything. This place is called the Black and White Zone, and he remembers that in this place he made ends meet as a liquidator. Looking at his hands, he fully realized that he had returned to the past. The next morning, he came out of the forest and looked at the lake, not understanding what was happening. He couldn't believe it was him, and at a younger age. But he was bothered by the mark, which was still with him even after the regression. He didn't know how, but Grimoire had definitely done something. He couldn't believe that Grimoire was capable of such a thing. But considering that the head of Deculin himself appeared to him, it means how serious his intentions were. There is very little information about him. But that doesn't matter to him anymore. In any case, it's not bad. And everything is too vivid to be a dream, and the stench of sewage is quite real. But it all ends with him being alive. And for him, it's a strong and powerful morning. But it's a kind of mindset that he will achieve great success no matter what. But at that moment, he stopped and didn't understand what it meant to achieve great success. Once he had a dream, and it was also the dream of his comrades. It was the reason why he decided to leave his post. A friend approached him and shared that in the black and white zone, they were nothing but vagabonds. They had no clothes, no food, and no education. And it became interesting what he thought was the worst thing about it. Aster replied that the worst thing was the lack of food. But Comrade believed that if they had only lacked food, they would not have been stuck in this dump. But why did he think their lives had ended up in this sewer? Aster was fine with everything, and Comrade thought that was the reason why their fates had turned out so terribly. But Aster interrupted him and reiterated that he was fine with everything. Seeing that his comrade narrowed his eyes and allowed him to speak, Comrade said that the most nightmarish thing was the lack of education. And if they had studied and trained properly, they would not have been caught and worked for the damned nobility. But Aster felt that if he ever managed to escape, he would like to open a library, a place where everyone, regardless of money, status, or gender, could freely read books. But he would have gone a step further and built a tower. There was no particular reason for this. He just liked tall things. And the location didn't matter either. He would fill it with every book he could find. However, there is something else that must be there. At the entrance to the first floor, he would place the secret manual of the Deculin family, and so that even the common people of the black and white zone, the scoundrels from noble families, the butchers from the market, could all see it. But the cover would display the Deculin emblem, and inside would be described techniques more valuable than human lives. Just imagining it makes his mouth water. But there is a problem: how to obtain the techniques. But his future self will take care of that. In any case, if he spreads the secret techniques of the Deculins everywhere, those bastards will lose everything. Lost in thought, he closed his eyes and enjoyed the moment. But suddenly, a guy flew right into his face. The guy said he had been looking for him everywhere. He had told him to stay put, but in the end, he found him here. Aster covered his face with his hands and didn't understand what was wrong with him. He was even attacking him. He also remembered that he was a problem solver, with more battles under his belt than most, except for air battles. Aster didn't let himself be mocked and grabbed his attacker by the leg. The guy was surprised that his leg had been grabbed. Aster said that the offender had hit him 7 times, and so he would hit him back 10 times. Aster didn't waste any time and landed an uppercut right to the jaw. But in the end, he was very surprised and did not understand why his arm was broken. But the offender got angry after that and didn't know how the brat dared to hit his hen. He was the youngest, yet he tried to hit his senior. And as it seems, the guy had completely lost his mind. At that moment, Aster closed his eyes and felt intense pain in his body, but his heart hurt even more than his body. Suddenly, the bully didn't look where he was going, stepped in shit, slipped, and fell into the river. Aster immediately realized that this was his chance. The offender got up and shouted after him, calling him a little freak. Aster knew that this wasn't an escape for him. He remembered his face. It was a strategic retreat, and he would remember those 57 blows forever. He was an experienced problem solver, and a man who didn't know what it meant to give up. Entering the alley, he held his hands and saw that everything was bad. And he wasn't one of those people who had ever held anything more than a pen in his hand. It was ridiculous for him. He sprained his wrist with one swing, and his body was incredibly weak. But suddenly, he decided to forget about the tower. First of all, he needed to get his body in shape. Unexpectedly, a guy approached him and asked if he was hungry. Aster looked up and didn't know if they were acquainted. The stranger replied that they didn't. But Aster thought so himself. His clothes were worn and tattered, but at the same time fashionable and expensive. He was probably the son of a nobleman who had lost the struggle for power and fled here. In other words, a little walking time bomb. Suddenly, the stranger introduced himself as Damian, and his mother's name was Bianca. But Aster didn't care. and he began to feel that he was learning things he didn't need to know. Aster decided to ask him if he was slow-witted. Damian replied that he didn't have a mother, but Aster apologized and said that he didn't have a father either, and that won him over. In any case, it was time for Damian to leave. He decided that he shouldn't mess with bombs. It was better to get rid of him before he became even more annoying. But Damian didn't leave and stood still. Aster decided to ask him if he would leave, but the guy replied that he would go with him. Aster thought he should hit him once and told him to get lost. But Damian reached out his hand and wanted to know if it hurt, and using his powers, he decided to help him. Seeing this, Aster understood immediately, but Damian informed him that it was a healing hand. But Aster realized that it was not a healing hand, it was the light of healing. A secret technique of the noble Blando family, defeated by the Declan family. And his instincts as a problem solver were now screaming. He had come into contact with something very northern and dangerous. But he doesn't understand that the Bando child has been forgotten in the black and white zone. His family should still be thriving at this time. Damian continued to heal him and heard Aster calling him. He stopped and decided to find out why he was calling him. But suddenly Aster remembered that the man from the Blanco family had different colored eyes, and they call him the Blanco monster. He is a madman who will not die even if he is killed, and his name is Damian von Blanco. Suddenly, Damian crouched down and, seeing the ants, began to count them. Aster watched this and did not understand if he was doing it seriously. But then he remembered when he was a problem solver. Before the regression, on one of the white days, he was sent to the Blanco family's territory on Deculin's orders. Aster understood that they could have dealt with the Blando family themselves. Why call them specifically? But Comrade didn't understand what was going on in the minds of the upper class. He had heard that some kind of monster lived in the Blando family. Apparently dozens of people had died. Aster assumed it was an ogre, but it could have been something similar. And then he saw it. Not an ogre, but a man tearing another man to pieces. He endlessly cast the Blando family's signature healing magic and laughed during the battle like a true madman. He was the monster of the Blando family, an insane butcher who would not die even after death. But he didn't understand that the Lord's only son, the direct heir to the Blando family, had forgotten himself in such a shabby place. Damian suddenly offered him something to eat. After all, his mother used to say that if you don't want to get sick, you need to eat well. And he was sick because he didn't eat. Aster understood that this was true. But the way he said it made him want to hit him, and he decided to ask the guy if he had any money. Damian suddenly took out a bag of coins and asked in response, "Did I really say that?" Aster was delighted to see the bag of money, hugged him, and made it clear that they were now friends. But Damian was surprised and didn't understand why he had suddenly decided that. Aster replied that if he said they were friends, then that was how it was. And friends share what they have. He began to shout with joy and say that he and his friend were going to fill their bellies. But Aster also became curious about what his friend had. Aster replied that he only had a friend. After eating, Aster said that it was a good dinner, and a shower after a meal is refreshing. Damian looked around and stood silently in place. But when Aster saw this, he decided to find out what he was doing. Damian replied that he didn't know there was a house above the place where they were eating. He had always been outside. It was the first time he had seen anything like this. Suddenly, he remembered something and fell to his knees, saying that he didn't have a father either. But Aster let him know that he did have a father. But Damian still denied it and shouted that he didn't. But he didn't know why he was trying to outdo him in this. Then he remembered that Damian had a mother. Damian looked around and said she wasn't there. But for Aster, this was something new. He decided to leave it at that and watch what happened. He asked him how long he had been alone. Damian replied that since he ran away from home, he had slept 10 times. Aster understood that since he had run away, they were looking for him. And if he had slept 10 times, that meant 10 days had passed. But Damian also shared that he still liked to take naps quite often. He could sleep twice a day, that is, take naps. And if you add it all up, it comes to 10 times. Aster guessed that it would be about 3 or 4 days. But Damian said that he hadn't napped since arriving here. The ground was too uncomfortable. Aster turned around and, seeing the pillow, covered his face and started shouting that Damian was completely insane from head to toe. And anyway, since the boy was stuck in the black and white zone, he could pretend to be his babysitter and form a bond with the Blando family, which didn't sound like a bad idea. Damian lay in bed and felt uncomfortable here too. And that could play a big role in the future when he came into conflict with the Deculans again. And there are many books in the homes of the nobility. But first, he needs to deal with something else. The resentment in 57 words stuck in his chest. He told Damian that he was going to bed and not to bother him. And if he did bother him, it would turn into a big problem. But Damian stood up abruptly and suggested breathing exercises. Aster replied that everything was fine, and Damian could do them too when he was done. Aster remembered that in his past life, he had built his magic on standard formulas given to problem solvers, but their limitations were obvious. So he broke into the homes of several noble families and stole their techniques. Once he was even nearly killed. Secret arts that he eventually mastered. The knight's strengthened body, spiritual arts. But still, the power he encountered just before death was a complete disaster. And that is why this time he will study the fundamental art of the Deculan family, the art of the source of the heavens. The root of all Deculan techniques, capable of harmonizing with the mana of all elements. He learned it for research, and now it came in handy. He activated the breathing technique. But suddenly his seal began to glow, and he began to feel a fire inside him, as if lava were flowing. He tried to calm himself and take control. And he needed to circulate the art of the source of the heavens. But when he looked at his hand, he saw skvern and did not understand where it came from. He immediately realized that it was a secret, mysterious power. And they say that only elite maniacs from noble families of the main clan use it. What if it was forcibly directed into streams to burn away the accumulated squalor of the souls of mana? Seeing this dream, he woke up with a start, screaming. He didn't understand how much time had passed. At that time, Damian did not wake up and continued to sleep. But for Aster, it was important that the streams were clean and his mana was purified. And this level of purity could be even higher than it was in his past life. But even so, it would be impossible to defeat Deculan, even if he were reborn hundreds of times. However, one thing was clear to him. His chances had increased. The problem solver never gives up, even in situations where the chances of success are almost zero. The next morning, Damian was surprised and shouted that his hair had turned dark. Aster did all this at night, hiding his bright platinum blonde hair and also changing his clothes. For now, the Blando family must not recognize him. Suddenly, Damian asked his new friend what they were going to do now. Aster smiled and suggested they go and twist someone's neck. Meanwhile, the bully woke up and said he had had a good sleep, and the weather was wonderful today. But when he saw a familiar face, he wondered who this youngster was walking with him. Approaching them, he decided to find out where he had been wandering. And what happened to him? Did he swim in sewage? And who is this little guy? He seems to have money. But Aster didn't listen to his nonsense and punched him right in the chest. Aster said he had come to the right place. And the fact that he remembered his face said enough. And for starters, he would get 123 blows. The other guys saw this and started asking what was going on. They surrounded the guys and asked who had come here. And they recognized their younger brother. Aster began to recognize many familiar faces around him, and it was a scary crowd, and now he'll see how far he can go today. Aster began to have fun to the fullest and beat up every guy who came within a meter of him. He was very happy with this situation and couldn't stop even for a second. Damian was surprised that his friend had wrapped his fist in magical energy, and he was striking rapidly. He shouted that it was amazing, but Aster managed to talk to him and told him what people usually say in such situations. "That's damn cool." Damian listened to him and repeated after his friend. Suddenly, one of the guys fell unconscious in front of him. Damian decided to help him because he didn't want to see him suffer, and he used his healing powers. The guy thanked him for his help, but Aster caught him and decided to find out how many blows it had been. After that, Aster made him squat down and began beating him with a log, but then he asked him how many he had counted. The guy was in so much pain that he had even forgotten to count. Suddenly, Aster turned to his friend. Damian heard this and thought it was his turn. He asked him to use his healing hand, while the guy begged him to stop. But Aster decided that the bastard would get 20 more blows. Damian immediately used his healing hand, but the guy considered them demons in his head and realized that he couldn't count beyond 100. After everything was done, he gathered them in line and said that they had done an excellent job. The guys were so used to it that they repeated after the man who beat them. Aster saw the good spirit in them and said he was proud of them. He decided to play with them again next time. Aster was actually very proud of himself. More than 100 blows per person. In total, he delivered 2,000 magnificent blows. Even for a liquidator who had fought everywhere except in a pre-birth battle, this was a new challenge. Suddenly, one of the guys approached him. He asked his permission to leave, thinking that the gentleman had beaten them enough. Aster replied that they were all free to go. But the guy suddenly said that this was actually their home. Aster immediately decided to find out if they were waiting for them to leave. But that was a bit problematic. The guys got scared and decided to leave on their own. Aster believed that this was not revenge, and it was indeed problematic. But he sensed that someone was approaching them, and moving at a very high speed. Aster understood that he was fast and stealthy. These were characteristic traits of an assassin, and they had probably come for his new friend. All this time he had been cautious and didn't know how they had found them. The Blando had found them much earlier than he had expected. Aster looked at his hand and realized that with so little mana, he could neither cast spells nor fight physically. This was not good, but he did not forget who he was. Even as a liquidator, he had never had an abundance of mana. He had lived his whole life encountering situations like this. Nothing new. And he decided to start by gathering all his remaining mana and compressing it. Aster gathered all his mana into one hole and decided that it should be enough. He aimed perfectly at his enemy and knew he only had one chance. But before he could shoot, he saw his enemy fall to his knees. The man immediately turned to his young master. Damian was shocked when he saw him and realized it was Alfred. Alfred began to explain that they had been searching for his master for a very long time. Where had the young master been living all this time? He hadn't been able to sleep a wink because he was so worried, but Damian asked him to let him go. But Alfred replied that he couldn't do that. Until he returned home, he would not let him go. Otherwise, he would have to kill him. Damian said he would never return. Aster realized at that moment that running away from his family had been nothing more than an impulsive departure from home. Alfred took Damian under his wing and apologized for such an unsightly scene. He introduced himself as the butler of the Blando family, and judging by everything, the young gentleman liked Aster very much. And if his friend didn't mind, would he accompany them home? Aster immediately began to think about the Blando house. He realized that the nobility usually despised dirt and shunned the common people. He couldn't quite figure out his motives. But that doesn't matter anymore. After all, he wanted ties with Blando. They control the passage to the city of Hazen. And this is where the best academy in the entire eastern region of Xenion is located, along with its incomparable library. And since he aims to build a top-level library, a visit there would not hurt. Aster replied that he would consider it an honor to do so. Alfredo took the gentleman aside and said that he had prepared a map and asked his friend to wait. Aster understood that this was a slight deviation from his route to his ultimate goal of building the library, but that was okay. All's well that ends well. And proudly dressed in his clothes, he decided to see for himself if the food at the Blando house was any good. A few hours later, Alfredo said that they had arrived at their destination. And this was the Blando family home. Aster got out and realized that this was his first official visit, and this was the Blando estate. Alfredo made it clear to them that it was late and they should rest for the night, and Lindsay would take care of them. Lindsay asked the guests to follow her. Damian was suddenly delighted to see Lindsay. He immediately began to apologize to her, but Lindsay did not forgive him for leaving and began to punish him. That same night, Alfredo immediately went to the head of the Blando family. The lady immediately decided to find out where Damian was. Alfredo replied that the gentleman was in the 7th black and white zone. Now he has returned home. Suddenly, the lady couldn't take it anymore and showed her anger with an outburst. The lady asked again, "The 7th black and white zone?" She immediately became concerned, wondering if he was injured. She wanted him to say that nothing had happened to him. She set her sights directly on him and made it clear that if even a single hair fell from her son's head. Alfredo asked the lady to calm down and listen to him. The lady listened to what the servant said and thought that it was all God's will. Alfredo believed that both the lady and the person who could have harmed the young gentleman were undoubtedly lucky. But who could withstand the wrath of a woman who had once been called a bloody witch? Moreover, when it came to her son, it was fortunate that everything had ended just like that. The lady told the servant that he had done a good job. Alfredo replied that he was just doing his job. However, there was something unusual. The lady was surprised and decided to find out what was unusual. Alfredo replied that there was a new friend of the master. The lady became curious about what was wrong with him. Alfredo replied that this friend had detected his presence, and he had already prepared to counterattack before he approached, and he had a mana bullet in his hand. The lady decided that this guy was talented, for a boy from the black and white zone to possess such abilities. Suddenly, Alfredo asked to make a request. The next day, he approached Aster and asked him to become his heir. Alfredo saw that the boy was surprised and thought that he would not refuse him. Aster believed that he was a butler of a noble family, and for a rat from the black and white zone, that meant honor and wealth, so he sent him to hell. Alfredo didn't understand right away, but thought he had misheard. Damian heard these words and asked what they meant. Aster showed his gratitude for considering him as his heir, but he prefers everything to stay as it is now. And once again, he repeats that he is very grateful. Alfred decided to find out why, but then he understood everything. Born in a black and white zone, a poor orphan, he mastered magic thanks to his natural talent. At that time, Aster saw that the servant of this family thought he was cool. Alfred understood that he himself had been raised in an ordinary family and behaved arrogantly, having no idea how high the sky was. He explained to the boy that the world was vast, but Aster replied that he was not small at all. But Alfred believed that he most likely thought he was capable of anything, even conquering the world. Aster replied that this was not quite the case, and the servant understood that now he had to be patient. And he decided to ask the young man if he had ever heard the expression, "goblin in the gorge." And right now, he was exactly there, and not going beyond the gorge, unaware of the dangers. Aster replied that he associated himself more with Viverna. Alfred got angry and decided to show the boy personally because he knew nothing, and how huge and terrifying this world is. That same day, Alfredo decided to show him personally and opened the room where the other students were training. The students were surprised and immediately greeted Mr. Butler. Alfred decided to ask the boy what he thought. They were all around his age, but already officially recognized as talents of the Blando house, and he was sure that he could sense something. Aster immediately realized that the house of Blando was no joke. It was hard to believe that they were still teenagers and very well trained, and their aura, though barely perceptible, filled the entire space. However, when he looked into their eyes, all he saw was a bunch of goblins. Aster shared what he felt. Alfred was delighted and decided to find out if he would accept the offer. And if he succeeded, he would shine as brightly as they did. But even if he didn't, he would shine brighter than anyone else, and he hated the light. Alfredo couldn't stop and wanted to know why. But suddenly one of the students raised his hand and addressed the butler. Alfredo asked the student, Winston, if he had anything to say. Winston replied that if he really felt something, he would not reject his offer. But if he rejected it, it meant that he couldn't feel it fully. And if the gentleman would allow it, he would like to share some of his experience with him. Alfredo asked the student if he wanted a duel. Winston replied that it wasn't exactly that. He would just let him understand what magic was. Alfredo saw that this guy was confident, but it was a good idea. The gentleman asked the boy what he thought. How about a simple duel with this young man? Aster realized it. How much of a nuisance he was to them. A lucky poor man who came out of nowhere. And surely that's how they saw him. Aster decided to find out if he could choose his opponent. Alfred gave him permission. Aster began to show who he would fight, and he would fight 5 students at once. But when he saw the fear in their eyes, he ordered them to die. Alfred was surprised, but suddenly began to laugh. He understood that this was exactly the spirit his heir should possess. He decided to ask the boy if he could take responsibility for his decision. Some might say that he had insulted the House of Blando. Aster replied that he would take responsibility. Alfred said that he would do so, 1 minute, and if he could hold out for just 1 minute, he would give him a gift. Otherwise, he would hold him accountable. Aster understood that most likely he meant that he would have to become his heir, and the old man was trying to drag him into it. Alfred immediately let everyone into the area and said it was time to get started. The apprentice asked the butler if it was dangerous. Alfred replied that that was precisely the value of it, and for his growth, it was necessary to break his stubbornness at a certain point. The boy understood that things were bad. His eyes were already half rolled back, and if the young gentleman's guest is injured, his career as a mentor will come to an end. Damian was also nearby and watched everything. The young man informed the young master that his friend was now in serious danger and asked him to stop the butler. Damian also replied that he was shocked, but the maid also informed him that if he intervened, Lady Gamo would reprimand him. Damian replied that he didn't care. Alfred asked his mentor what he was doing. Let him start his duel. The guy agreed and proceeded to do so. The tutor understood that an order was an order. He did everything he could, but the maid suddenly thought about it and said she would be back soon. He should not interfere in anything. Damian smiled and agreed with her. The mentor left and said he would announce the rules. The duel would be step by step. But Alfred suggested that the fight be without rules. The mentor agreed and announced that the format would be without rules. The duel would continue until one side surrendered. However, the mentor could stop the duel at any moment, and they should keep that in mind. The guy considered Aster to be poor, and maybe the young gentleman and the butler took pity on him, but he seriously believes that the whole world revolves around him, and now he will crush him and show everyone his true worth. The mentor waved his hand and began the battle. Aster did not approach them and met his opponent head-on. All of his opponents were wounded and clutched their bodies, but the most talkative one remained on his feet. And then Aster began to laugh and decided that it would be better to share his experience with them. And first of all, don't underestimate those who are smaller. Winster realized that it was a magic bullet, and that was basic mana control. And mana requires too much, so it is useless in battle. Second, Aster said that you shouldn't judge others so easily, and he fired several bullets at his opponent's heads at once. Third, Aster explained that the world is vast and cruel, and with tremendous speed he approached him and struck him directly in the head. Aster said that now he would instill all this experience directly into them, and they should study it well. Winster grabbed his face and replied that it wasn't magic, but Aster didn't stop there, and flying at him with both feet made it clear that it was magic, and it's called physical magic. Everyone was shocked by what was happening and couldn't believe their eyes that a newcomer was beating up students who had been training for several years. Alfredo became curious about how much this guy had compressed it to release so many magic bullets, and judging by its power, it must have been compressed at least 4 or 5 times. And if he had released it then, it would have been very bad. And this is real natural mana mastery. And what's more, where did he learn to beat people up like that? They were all like little children next to him. Damian did not stand aside and, accepting his mana, decided to heal them so that they would not feel pain. But suddenly someone approached Alfred, and it turned out to be Lady Gamo. The mentor was also surprised that Lady Gamo herself had approached them, and Lady Rancy also came to their aid. Lady Gamo decided to find out what was going on. Alfred replied that he wanted to conduct a simple test. Gamo was surprised and did not understand what test he was talking about. And he calls this a test? But then she saw her son treating the injured students and trying too hard. She ordered him to tell all the students to stop, and Damian should return to his room. She also told Aster to return to his room, but she gave Runfit's mentor a very stern look. The mentor lowered his head and replied that he had done everything in his power, but she did not continue the conversation and said that he was fired. The tutor was shocked by what he heard and did not want to be treated this way. In the evening, she called Alfred to her and said that she understood what he was trying to achieve. But this time he had crossed the line. Alfred apologized to the lady and replied that he had lost his temper and would accept any punishment. But Lady Gamo was curious about what had happened during the sparring between Aster and the students. Had Damian helped him? Alfred replied that he hadn't helped him. He was just very talented at beating people up, and he remembered that he had used the magic bullet he had mentioned earlier during today's duel, but he compressed it at least 4 or 5 times, increasing its power. Gamo realized that this meant he had exceptional mana control. She hadn't seen the duel itself, but it must have been extremely spectacular. He had defeated 5 students single-handedly, with just 1 magic bullet. No matter how high a mage's level is, it is incredibly difficult to control pure mana, but Lady Gamo was curious about his response to the offer of an heir. Alfredo replied that he had confidently rejected the offer. Lady Gamo understood that she would have to reevaluate Aster and reconsider her opinion of him. She instructed him to invite Aster here. Lady Gamo was pleased to see him and invited him to sit down. Aster was surprised that the lady had called him, but Lady Gamo placed a box on the table and said to him that she had heard that Alfred had promised him a gift. Aster remembered that the servant had offered to give him a gift if he could hold out for just 1 minute. He did not expect the promise to be fulfilled so soon, nor that Lady Gamo herself would present him with the gift. Lady Gamo gave him permission to open it. Aster slowly picked it up and opened it, seeing a bright light that blinded his eyes. Lady Gamo interrupted him and explained that it was a high-ranking item. Even in Blando, only those recruited from the top 5 divisions of Manu could receive it. Aster didn't understand, because usually good relations ended with dinner. If gifts were involved, she most likely had ulterior motives. And for a reward for a winning bet, a medium-ranking item would be enough, but it had to be high-ranking. Lady Gamo told him that he didn't need to worry. He had previously helped Damian in the black and white zone, and she also wanted to apologize for what had happened today. but Aster decided to find out if he ate the pill. Would he have to join them? Lady replied that this was not the case. Then Aster decided that it was poisoned. He was surprised, because Lady said there were no conditions. Lady confirmed that there were absolutely none. Then Aster accepted it and thanked her for the gift. But Lady saw nothing special in this. He considered it an unexpected benefit. But Lady Gamo explained that she also had something else she would like to offer him. Aster already understood that she would ask for something in return. But Lady Gamo said that she was talking about his admission to the academy. Would he like to attend with Damian? After all, her son was supposed to enroll there last year, but he was strongly opposed, so enrollment had to be postponed until this year. She hadn't expected him to run away like that. That's why she was making him this offer. Damian liked him too. Damian also said that if his friend was with him, he would agree to go. Aster understood that this made sense. And for Bianca, it was a big deal. She was afraid that her son would run away again if she forced him to enroll in the academy. And there was no other way to change his mind. And of course, it's not a bad opportunity for him either. If he wants to get ahead in this world, driven by blood ties and connections, it wouldn't hurt to get an academic education. And that sounds pretty good, but it feels like he's being put on a leash. Aster replied that he would definitely think about it. The lady agreed and asked him to give her an answer when he had made his decision. And this has nothing to do with her request, just simple curiosity. Why did he reject Alfred's offer to become his heir? Aster smiled and replied that he valued his needs. Meanwhile, Alfredo was standing outside the door, eavesdropping on everything. On a dark night, Aster decided to meditate and realized that it was all because of the pill. Only 1/10 of it had been absorbed, but the increase in mana was already significant. And perhaps it was because of his mastery of fire. Usually, when he consumed the elixir, there were losses, and the mana became slightly cloudier. But here, nothing like that happened. The effect exceeded all expectations. He thought about the academy for a long time, but his answer was obvious, and it would be easier for him to find a sponsor there. And there were plenty of advantages. But still, he felt as if someone was about to pull his nose, and he suddenly decided to run and clear his head a little. But unexpectedly, a stranger closed the door and decided to ask him if he was the one and only Aster. Aster immediately noticed that the guy had platinum-colored hair, and apparently he was the direct descendant of Damian, which meant he was from a side branch of the family. He still didn't understand what kind of family they were. They got on his nerves all the time. But Aster decided to deceive him and deny his assumptions. Hearing this, the guy was simply shocked and didn't understand why not. The guy also began to analyze and said loudly that Aster had ash-gray hair and some kind of nasty squint. And according to him, everything added up. But Aster replied that no, his hair color depends on the lighting, and the difference can be significant. And if he looked closely at his eyes, where did he see the nastiness? The guy left everything and realized that the guy's gaze was really kind. He apologized and went on his way. But Aster didn't like that and showed him his middle finger. But then Alfred came running up and said that he had come to make up for the misunderstanding. He hadn't slept all night, worrying that they hadn't had time to talk yesterday. And even if he became a butler, he wouldn't be scrubbing floors for nothing. It was all a misunderstanding. Aster was still smiling. But when he heard the gentleman's words, he stopped and looked at him in surprise. The guy said that he could definitely recognize that look, and such unpleasant eyes, like those of a dead goblin, are rarely seen. Aster decided to confess, but the young man thought he was lying to his face and wasn't ashamed in the least. He wanted to teach the young man a lesson, but when he saw Alfred's gaze, he immediately calmed down. He decided to let him go for now, and asked him to come to the magic building. He would quickly teach him some manners. Alfred decided to ask the guy if something had happened. Aster replied that everything was fine and nothing special. Aster thought that he was in the right mood now, so they would talk later. Suddenly, he decided to ask Mr. Butler if he could see the lady now. When he arrived, the lady allowed him to enter and said that the young man had been asking for a meeting since early morning. Had he already made up his mind? Aster replied that everything was correct. He let her know that he was enrolling in the academy. The lady was surprised that he had made his decision so quickly. It was time to start preparing as soon as possible. In the meantime, he should rest. Aster said goodbye and thanked her for her concern. Meanwhile, Alfredo opened the door and listened to their decision. He asked the lady if the young man had definitely agreed. The lady replied that fortunately he had agreed. He was so happy that he started shouting that the young man had agreed, and he had seen it from the very beginning, and everything would be fine for the first semester because they would pay for it. But he didn't know what would happen in the second semester. After all, it would not be easy for a rootless person from the black and white zone to get such a sum. And he would receive a payment notice for the second semester, and he would start to get nervous. And why is that? Thought Aster, and he realized that it was because he wanted to continue his studies. And then he gets a helping hand, his sponsorship contract. And since he is Alfred, he will support the offer. Lady informed him that he was talking too loudly. Alfred agreed that he had simply gotten carried away, and since it was almost lunchtime, he would go to the kitchen. The lady understood why he was so happy. He had been rejected so many times in his romantic pursuits, and now he finally had a chance. In this sense, the academic plan was flawed. But Alfred was so loyal because he himself had once been caught in the same trap by the senior butler. But Aster considered Alfred a pathetic man. And now his magical body had been summoned, and they said that the boy from the ordinary branch was here. Upon entering, he met a worker in uniform and decided to find out why they had come. Aster remembered that he did not know him. The priest showed him the way and said that they were waiting for him. He asked the gentleman to come inside. He approached the door and asked him to watch his head. Aster went to his room, gathered his things, and realized what it meant to watch his head. The servant suddenly asked him if he was Lord Aster. The young man introduced himself as Henji von Blando, and she decided to ask them if they had come to see her younger brother. Aster didn't understand which brother they were talking about. He remembered that when he was a problem solver, he had to make his way into various magical institutions. And then he noticed one thing. The magicians, whom everyone calls Pisaki, have one thing in common. The condition of their hair is terrible, and they constantly pull at their hair, causing it to stop growing. And if you divide this process into stages, it turns out that in the first stage, they don't want to admit to baldness, so they hide their heads under deep hoods. In the second stage, they resign themselves and wear their baldness openly. In the third stage, they shave their heads completely. And finally, in the fourth stage, they begin research to achieve the impossible, the magic of hair regrowth. But this guy is a different case. Fawn decided to start by asking the guest to accept his apology. He had spoiled his younger brother too much, and he dared to treat the guest so rudely. Aster noticed that this guy had thick hair, and he looked young. Aster decided to ask if the guy worked at the Magic Institute. Fawn replied that this was correct, and now he was serving as deputy manager. Aster was shocked that this guy was the deputy manager at such a young age, and it is unlikely that the Blando family would appoint someone to this position solely because of their bloodline. This indicates that he truly possesses certain abilities. Von considered Mr. Aster to be a curious man. He was not at all like the usual ragged people from the black and white zone. Aster laughed and agreed with him. He thought it would be better if this guy came with a knife. His kind smile was alarming, and they are incompatible with him. Von suddenly remembered and heard that he had been offered to enter the Xenian Academy, and he congratulates the gentleman. He said that this was a great opportunity for Aster. There was a lot to learn there. Incidentally, he himself was a graduate of the Xenian Academy, class of 145. But Aster didn't understand what this sudden attempt to become related was all about. But then Fawn apologized and explained that he was just happy that he was also entering Xenian, and blurted out something unnecessary. And maybe it was time to get down to business. Aster didn't understand what business he was talking about. But Fawn decided to clarify something first. Would he be willing to go to prison for his friend? Aster didn't understand what this idiot was talking about. Fawn said that the fate of the Blando clan depended on it, and if he was willing to take the risk, he would give him the book. When Aster saw the book, he realized that it was the secret of the Blando clan, and there was still light of healing in it. Meanwhile, the lady was in the garden, watching over her beautiful flowers. She suddenly sighed unexpectedly and realized that her tormentor, academician Damian, had finally been eliminated. It was a weight off her mind, but she believes that Aster is a rare find. He has talent and a good character. Although Alfred said that at times he was insolent and even rude, but at that age, it was natural. And what she liked most was that, even knowing about Damian's origins, he remained firm, without fawning. And in this, he is different. That is why he is noteworthy. But for the same reason, he will probably never become attached to anyone, and he will always be free as a bird. People can be held in different ways. He needs to think about which one is right for him. Damian cannot let such a valuable person slip away. But Aster didn't really understand why Blando was giving him secret teachings. And he doesn't understand what the catch is? pure, transparent eyes, and therefore impossible to read. Usually, whether kind or evil, eyes reveal something. But here, like a murderer's, there is not a shadow of emotion. In other words, he wears a mask, and one so thick that he himself probably doesn't know his true face. Fawn said that he was offering this without frivolity. It was not worth rushing recklessly after the nearest reward. Aster replied that he would answer him, and he saw that the awkwardness had disappeared. But then he decided not to speak. He understood that since they were already in the same boat, there was no point in squirming. But he said that if Fawn had a request, he could speak. He would listen to him, and if it was within his power, he would do it. If not, he would refuse. Fawn decided to ask him, even if the knowledge itself could cost him his life, and if he refused, he could kill him. Aster was not afraid and told him to kill him. He would die once, not twice. And suddenly he realized that he had died twice. Suddenly, Fawn unexpectedly used his powers, and with the help of his magic, everything flew off the table. But blood still slowly dripped into his glass, filling it to the brim. But Aster was not afraid and looked him straight in the eye. But Fawn stopped and decided that he could not compete with him. And Mr. Aster passed the test, and he would speak to him directly. In fact, he just needed someone he could trust. But alas, he could not be from the Blando family. Aster realized that he had almost hit him first, but Fawn realized that he had no particular hopes. The vagabonds from the black and white zone all look alike. The young gentleman is too young to understand people. But if even his beloved valet allowed such a vagrant to be near him, it meant that there was something about him. But Aster saw that his younger brother had also clashed with the guest. Wasn't that a convenient excuse for Fawn? Fawn told Mr. Aster to choose one or the other, familiarity or respect, and not to mix the two. Aster agreed with him. But Fawn believed that in any case, a convenient excuse had appeared. He said that his brother had gotten into a fight with the guest, and he had to call the guest in for a talk. It seemed quite natural. Aster understood that it was all logical. Did the deputy head of the Magical Institute need an excuse to summon him? Vaughn began to smile and informed the young man that he had guessed correctly. It was difficult for him to be the first to speak. But he had to take into account that these were not family quarrels in the Blando clan, but strong bonds. But Fawn said that he was under the supervision of the Deculan family. Aster was surprised and decided to ask him why. Fawn replied that since he had said that he didn't care about their lives, he would speak frankly, although he was not going to kill him. The thing is, he was now studying the secret technique of the Deculan clan, and it seemed that it had come to light, and the guy knows what it is. Secret teachings available only to blood relatives of the Deculan clan, but he managed to obtain it through indirect means. But Aster raised his hand and asked him to stop. And the man who should have died long ago, how did he survive? And if the guy had investigated him on behalf of Blando, he would certainly have looked for a way to counteract it, wouldn't he? Vaughn replied that he was right. The Deculans lacked common sense. If he had limited himself to searching for vulnerabilities, he, the deputy manager, would have been killed long ago. But Aster said that at first he really only wanted to study ways to neutralize them. But Fawn shared what he saw later. Technology is the root of all the secret teachings of the Deculans, and hidden within them is a method that opens up the possibility of surpassing even the ideal. And he couldn't stop. And now Mr. Aster understands his feelings. Aster was shocked and thought that this guy wasn't just crazy. He was completely insane. And was he really researching such things within his own family? After thinking about it, he realized that everything fit together perfectly. In a past life, the Deculans destroyed the Blando family. The incident was related to Henji's research into a new heavenly formula. And this Farron had put the fate of the Deculans on the line to crush the Blando family precisely because of this. And from the very beginning, he saw the potential in the new heavenly formula, and the reason why he was insanely strong. Aster thought hard and didn't hear anything around him. Vaughn addressed him and decided to find out if he really regretted it, and this matter really did require boldness. But Aster decided to end the conversation and asked why he was looking for him. Vaughn replied that he had not told his family about his research into the celestial formula. It seemed that Blando had planted a spy on him, but he couldn't figure out who it was. But Aster said that if the secret research had been leaked, surely there was someone who could be suspected. For example, the secretary. Vaughn understood that this could not be the case. More precisely, it had more to do with how the information was obtained. But Aster suggested that if they got on his trail, then the security formula had been leaked to them on purpose. Vaughn started laughing and agreed with him. And as soon as he realized they were being followed, he immediately released part of the formula as a countermeasure. He didn't want to die either. Aster asked if it wouldn't be easier to switch sides to the Deculans. He thought they would gladly accept him there. Vaughn replied that he had his reasons. And in any case, Aster, since he was not directly related to the family, he needed him to do it secretly. And to tell the truth, it is a joint research project, but the part that is on it is not progressing well. He will make sure that he receives a decent reward. And he asks him to deliver the papers to Professor Faroon at the Xanion Academy. Then he will share with him the technique of healing light. Aster thought about it and smiled, realizing that this was his chance. Aster agreed and said that he would study the technique of healing light at his own risk. But he wants to receive the new heavenly formula later. Otherwise, they would not be able to become true comrades in the same boat, and he decided to double the bet. Vaughn saw that the gentleman was truly shameless, but Aster set conditions for him to decide. Otherwise, he would refuse. Vaughn agreed and understood that the name of the technique did not matter. After all, he had not yet mastered the heavenly formula, so his research was useless to them. But he would share with him what he received. However, he also had a condition. Until his dissertation was finished, he might need his help, and he hoped that the gentleman would lend a hand. If they were in the same boat, it was the least he could do. Aster agreed and replied that there would be no problem. He would help with anything related to the research, and he said that he could not read. Handing the paper back, he suddenly pulled it back and said he was joking. But Vaughn thought that he had not only no shame, but also no sense of humor. Aster took the paper and decided to find out if he could trust the professor. Vaughn said that from their student years to their assistant professorship, they had competed for first and second place. But the competition ended when he returned to the Blando family. However, Aster understood that he was still stronger. Or maybe he was just imagining things. And now he understood that the world was really going to hell. There was another madman like him at the academy. That same evening, Aster came home and took out all the books. He realized that the guy had packed everything into a spatial pocket so he wouldn't get caught. But he didn't understand why he needed so many. Suddenly, among all the junk, he saw a strange white letter. Opening it, he saw that it was addressed to him personally. The letter said that the most important grimoires had been selected for him, which he was obliged to master. Below, he left him instructions on how to study. He asked him to study diligently and cultivate a mind worthy of his position. And it was his friend, Henji von Blando. Aster looked around and realized that the gift was indeed quite good. And in compiling a step-by-step program from the basics to the highest magic, Vaughn truly proved himself to be a genius. He took a blank sheet of paper and filled the table with the books he would have to study. He took the list of suggested books and decided that if he excluded the technique of healing light and the dissertation on the new heavenly formula, there would be about 132 volumes. Placing the grimoire of light healing in the tower for everyone to see was a separate issue that would need to be discussed with Damian, and you could call it a friend's privilege. And those 132 books that Henji gave him weren't just 132 volumes. They formed a single category. If such a category exists, anyone who wants to study magic will be able to build a foundation on it. Aster realized that before, he had only thought about storing books in the tower, but now he didn't. This would become the very essence of the tower, a place where every seeker could learn. Vaughn also considered him an unexpected find. And if he turned out to be even slightly useful, he planned to simply send him away with his dissertation, and if not, use him and throw him away. But Aster is an interesting guy. Besides, he's not afraid of death. And as he began to laugh, he realized that Aster seriously wanted to be killed. In fact, he only threatened him to test him, but honestly, he really had no reason to kill him. And understanding his eyes, Aster was serious about everything he said. He didn't care whether he died or not. And he is different from other pigs. And it even sounds funny. And it seems to him that Aster is hiding a lot, but he is not bad at his job. He has now found a comrade who is able to stand by his side and look in the same direction. And he even craves the results of his work, and that's a normal feeling. And suddenly he remembered the situation and wondered if Aster really couldn't read. But that couldn't be. The next morning, Aster prepared for a new day and decided to dress in elegant clothes. A man came in and told him it was time to go. Upon arrival at the academy, he would need to fill out some paperwork. He and the young gentleman were exempt from the entrance exams. It seemed that Mr. Astor had now truly become a student at the academy, and the bones suited the gentleman very well. Astor smiled and thanked her for the compliment. Astor understood that it was customary for noble families to be exempt from exams. It was like a special privilege, although he himself did not mind being exempt. Suddenly, Damian started shouting and asking him to hurry up, but he was not alone. The lady came out to see them off. As they parted, the lady asked her son to take care of himself. Then she turned to Astor. She made it clear to him that he had been given an excellent opportunity, and she sincerely hoped that he would achieve the results he needed. Astor thanked her for her advice and realized that his plan was, of course, to achieve results. And now before him stood the greatest academy on the eastern continent of Xenion. Countless patrons awaited him there, and he intends to contact them. He wishes his classmates to wait for him. On the way, Damian marveled at the beauty of this place. Meanwhile, Astor saw that Henji was indeed an outstanding magician. The basics of magic are simple, but they can be interpreted in different ways. Take water, for example. For some, it is a source of life, while for others, it is a disaster. It all depends on your point of view. The same principle can lead to different results, which is why noble houses developed in their own ways. After reading all the works on magic from the pocket dimension, he understood. Henji's curriculum was closely related to Deculin's heavenly formula. Suddenly, Damian asked him to look because they had already arrived. Astor looked out the window and saw the Xenion Academy. He understood immediately and remembered that it was the Xenion Academy. But Lady Rancy informed them that the carriage would not go any further. And according to the instruction of the great sage, the first rector, on the day of admission, everyone, regardless of origin, must walk this path on foot. And here they would have to part ways. May the admission ceremony be successful, and may he gain worthy knowledge. After saying goodbye to them, Damian informed his friend that they needed to hurry. Lindsay also said that if they were late, there would not be enough seats at the ceremony. Astor did not understand what kind of nonsense was going on. This was a village theater, where seats were allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. But then he remembered that Lindsay had said that. And he realized that she had laid the groundwork so that Damian wouldn't be lazy and late. And he decided that this time he would buy a ticket. He may be sullen, but he cannot be called shameless. Not because it is more convenient for him. When he arrived, Damian was surprised to see so many people. It turned out that Lindsay was right. A little longer, and they really would have been left without seats. Astor realized that this was too much. He looked at the list and saw that their seats were 11 and 12. Damian suggested that he take other seats, lest someone else take them. But Astor asked him to wait a moment. And he understood that his friend didn't want to go to the academy himself. But then why was he so happy? But suddenly, turning around, he saw Damian fall and cry out. Looking up, Damian saw a huge man standing in front of him who had pushed him. Astor approached his friend and decided to find out if he was okay. Damian smiled and replied that everything was fine. He probably wasn't looking where he was going and apologized to the man. Suddenly, the man told them to stop and showed them how Damian had stained his clothes. Astor immediately began to analyze the situation and realized that the man was from some noble family. In such a situation, Damian would usually have finished him off. But at that moment, Damian apologized and decided to wipe it off. He wiped it with his saliva, thinking that it would make it even cleaner. And he would wipe it so that it would shine even brighter than before. Astor saw the veins on the guy's face and realized that a fight was definitely about to start. But the guy couldn't take it anymore and punched Damian in the head, telling him to get out of there. But Astor saw this, and seeing the swing, stepped in and stopped his fist, telling him not to do anything stupid. Maybe they would stop there. The guy was surprised and decided to find out who he was. Damian immediately said that he was his friend. The guy calmed down and thought that not everyone was ready to take a hit for a friend. But today, he would regret that choice. Astor understood that he wouldn't be able to make friends with everyone on the first day, and he really wanted to say that words alone wouldn't be enough. The students immediately gathered around and shouted that a fight was about to start, but they didn't know who they were. Someone replied that the bullies seemed to be from the Dolenf clan. The rest were new faces. They began to analyze who would win. Someone said that Dolenfe would prevail, and they said that there was a very strong guy among the newcomers this year. But suddenly the senior member arrived and decided to find out what they were doing there. He saw that someone was already fighting. The guys asked if they should break it up. The guy replied that of course they should, and while no harm had been done, it would be easier for them to fight that way. And let them order the guys to move away. And the gray-haired one is also a mage, so let him set up a protective field. The guys all got together and used their abilities to create a protective field. They surrounded them and shouted that they had bet everything on Hickster, and the other 2 tickets were for food. The guy threw a punch and introduced himself as Hickster, the second son of the glorious Dolanfee family. He asked his opponent to give his name. Astor replied that he could not boast of a great family like his opponent, and that he could consider him just a random passerby. Hickster was surprised and realized that he was not from a noble family, but that didn't matter anymore. Such a narrow space was disadvantageous for a mage, so he generously gave him the first move. He told him to attack. Astor smiled at that moment and considered him a clown. He said that the one who talks the most is the one who does not want to resolve the issue with words. Taking off his tie, he decided to find out if his opponent was afraid. But Hickster got angry and flew into attack with his bare fists. Astor stood still at that moment and did not even move, only turning his head to the side so that he would not be hit. But Astor informed him that there were 2 of them against him, and seizing the moment, he punched him with all his might right in the beard. Seeing this, Hickster knew that he could take as many punches as he wanted from a student of the magic course. Flying several meters away, he felt a heavy fist, and he thought that this guy was a magician. But Astor began to walk towards him to finish what he had started. Hickster noticed that healing magic appeared near his face. Turning around, he saw that it was the guy he had pushed who was doing it. But he didn't understand why he was doing it. However, he realized that this guy was from a noble family. But Astor didn't stop and continued to attack him with his powerful fists. Astor said that since he had time to look around, Hickster began to defend himself from the blows, but nothing helped. Hickster saw that one was beating him and the other was healing him. Damian was happy at that moment and enjoyed the moment. He thought it was crazy. His heart was even pounding. It would be better to just take it and pass out. Suddenly, he felt fear and took a step back. People began to ask him what he was doing. Don't spare them. They began to cheer for him and shout that he was the hope of hand-to-hand fighters, and they believed only in him. Hickster couldn't move and didn't know what to do next. After all, everyone was looking at him. He was so angry that he didn't understand what he was doing and flew straight at him with his fists. But Astor dodged and considered it a good blow. Hickster begged him not to ignore him, and he unleashed his magic with his blow. The students were delighted and finally got the hickey they had been waiting for. He began to feel that the hit was direct. But why is it so easy, Hickster thought. Astor managed to dodge all his blows and did a few backflips. He got to his feet and said it was dust. Seeing this, Hickster became even more angry and ran to attack a couple more times. But Astor stood still and watched what his opponent would do. He noticed that Damian was healing this guy all the time, so to finish him off, he needed to knock him out with one blow. He decided to see if that would be enough to knock him out. He channeled his magic directly into his hand. He understood that this technique, which he and his comrades had created in a previous life, drew energy from the collision of magical particles. And this technique could not be classified as purely magical or hand-to-hand combat. It was a technique that utilized the true nature of magic. He responded by using the collision method. The mages didn't understand what it was, because they were scattered by such energy. But it all ended badly for Hickster. He couldn't repel Astor's attack and fell to the ground. Everyone was shocked and did not expect such an ending. Astor raised his hand and asked them for applause. He got what he wanted. The students were happy with his victory and shouted that it was cool. They didn't understand if he was really a magician, and what a heated fight it was. And this was the very coup. Suddenly, Damian turned to his friend and said that they had won. Astor calmed him down and wanted him to stop sucking his thumb. A student who was considered strong saw them and said that a student of the Magic Corps was getting involved in such fights, and he thinks it's just indecent. But suddenly someone in the crowd shouted and asked everyone to step aside. He approached them and decided to find out who had been attacking people since the first day, and if they didn't calm down now, everyone would get it. Astor thought about it and realized that he was probably the one who had caused the trouble. But everything was actually fine. He was a hooligan by nature. There were many ways to get away, and everyone had fun, so it was easy. Damian suddenly started shouting that they hadn't done it and decided to confess to what he had done. The boss heard that this guy had confessed and started heading towards them. Damian was still confessing that they had done it. After that, they arrived at the senior's office and informed him that Damian had confessed to everything. In this case, he would allow them to avoid penalty points this time. Besides, the student did not seem to have been seriously injured. He would continue to monitor Astor in the future. Leaving the office, Astor felt relieved, and the admission ceremony had not yet begun. The students recognized him immediately. They couldn't believe that a guy with such a body had defeated a martial arts master, but they also understood that he was a mage, though they didn't know how he had fought. Damian was surprised and saw that everyone was looking at them. But Aster didn't like it, because now he was considered a celebrity. Finding his place, he told his friend that they would sit there. Damian was delighted and thought that his friend had already found them seats. And all the guys here are cool. Aster immediately agreed with him. After listening to the history of this academy, Damian couldn't help but fall asleep. But Aster saw that the rector had good stamina, standing for so long and giving his speech. But when he saw that Damian had fallen asleep, he decided to help him and, raising his hand, wiped the drool from his mouth. But suddenly, someone approached the director and said that there was a place where he needed to go for a moment. But the principal became curious. What could be more important than the admission ceremony? The guy explained everything to the director, and the director officially apologized to the students. He said that he suddenly had urgent business and had to leave. And with that, he would end his speech, and the ceremony would continue. Suddenly, a woman with red hair walked by and shouted for everyone to pay attention to her. Everyone was instantly frightened by her squeaky voice and was shocked that she would continue speaking. The girl introduced herself and said her name was Jaira. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the rector was unable to finish his speech, so she would continue the admission ceremony in his place. And then they would begin with the freshman oath. First was the representative of the magic faculty students, Dahlia de Diné. People were shocked that the Diné family had participated in the entrance exams. And did she really lack the ability? But someone told the guy to think before he spoke. She is the third in line of succession and the head of the house's family. And if she really lacked ability, would the Diné family have sent her to take the entrance exams? Aster understood that if the Decolon family was considered the leading magical dynasty in the East, then the Diné family was second among the magical houses. Among them, Dahlia grew up in the Diné family, which had remained in second place for many years, and became a magician who was to represent the family in the future. Her abilities were also quite good, and even at the time of Troubleshooter's retirement, she was of considerable help. But Aster understood that the fastest king of webtoons, they were more like bitter enemies of Ponce than benefactors to each other. Still, it was nice that Dahlia was a freshman this year. Jaira called on the representative of the martial arts students, Polara, and told him to come forward. Aster understood that if a martial arts student's surname was not mentioned, it meant that he was not from a noble family or house. And so that family, the Hicksters or hipsters, was about on the same level. It was even interesting to wonder how the noble houses would feel about this. At that point, all the representatives loudly declared that the oath was complete. But Jaira said that next she would introduce the teachers who would be teaching the students of the 172nd class. She asked the teachers to come forward one by one. Suddenly, Aster saw Dahlia's gaze and wondered what it meant. Or was it just his imagination? It seemed to him that their eyes had met, but that wasn't important at the moment. Suddenly, Dahlia lost her footing and fell down the steps onto the ground. Aster thought it was Professor Perun, but he couldn't understand when the professor appeared on the podium and began his speech. But then Professor Perun came out on the podium and explained that he would be teaching them a basic course on the principles of magic. Aster actually thought he would be similar to Henji in atmosphere, but it was completely different. But even Henji was a socially acceptable person, so it was not worth judging too quickly. Jiren decided to end the introduction of the teachers and close the admission ceremony. They should follow the administrators to their assigned dormitories. After these words, Aster asked his friend to wake up. Damian slowly opened his eyes and asked if it was all over. Aster replied that no, he had been caught sleeping and expelled, and now they would have to go home. Damian was shocked to hear this and started screaming in panic. But the next day, Aster did not expect Damian to scream so loudly over a little joke. Seeing the door ajar, he entered and saw that the room was already ready and located on the top floor. And he was really impressed by the academy. These everyday items are lying on the sofa, and it seemed that all students were given the same things to use. Even in small items, status is immediately apparent. But over time, everyone will buy their own personal items. Suddenly, the door opened and a guy walked in. Aster thought it was his neighbor. Aster remembered that his name was Polar, and for some reason, he thought he was looking at him askance. The guy asked them to be as quiet as possible, and he didn't care what Aster did, and they could stay awake until late at night. But it would be nice if they didn't interfere with each other. Of course, this also applied to conversations after that time. Aster immediately disliked his new neighbor. He looked him in the eye as if he wanted to kill him.